right? And so what you're trying to do is take in as much as you can.
Yeah.
And so the language that comes to me more naturally is the language of a field. Okay, it's like a magnetic field or electric field.
Yeah, the
or
phenomenologists like that idea.
Yes, that's right. And in that case, what I'm trying to do is not focus on any one thing in particular, like I might when I'm reading. So then I'm using my visual attention and I'm focusing on this particular thing. Or I'm an artist and I'm trying to do the glint on the eyeball for the finishing touch.
Yeah.
So my eyes are wide open and I'm concentrating and I'm trying to do this and everything else is in the field. But that I think is coextensive in terms of how our perceptual faculty works, is if I am in the bad neighborhood at night, and what I've tried to do is just expand my attention to encompass this whole field, so that if anything moves in that entire field, then I can zoom in on that.
That's a good objection. Okay. That's a good objection. I guess I could make that initial analogy more sophisticated, because I would say then that the tabernacle structure, center and periphery, is characteristic of explored and familiar territory. You're making a case that there's a different perceptual mode in unexplored territory, and there is. So birds have a prey eye and a predator eye. And the predator eye acts like the painter that you described who's focusing on one thing, because you zero in on the thing you're after. The I'm prey eye, so that would be the bird's, the other eye, is scanning in exactly the way that you described, deprioritizing the center, amplifying the input from the periphery. Exactly. And that maps onto the hemispheres. So the left hemisphere does the perceptual mapping that this is in right-handed people. The left hemisphere does the focal perception that you described, that's detail oriented and that deprioritizes the periphery, and the right hemisphere does the opposite. And you know, and that's I suppose you could say at a biological level, that's because it's eat or be eaten, right, in the most primal possible way. And so there's a perceptual system for things you're going to eat, and there's a perceptual system for you might be on the menu.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Okay.
And yeah, so that's see, the thing that's so curious about that, and that you just highlighted, is that the ceremonies for taking possession of a territory that are anthropologically specified, it's usually driving a stake or a central point, a flag, a standard, a staff into the ground, that signifies camp, right? Or it signifies the possession of that territory. That establishes a center with a set of peripheries and with foreignness at the, at the edge of the periphery. And that does establish a certain kind of perception that's associated with security. So the tabernacle style of perception would be the perception that's associated with explored territory. That's exactly right. That's the perception of order. Like, order is where the things you want are happening. That's a good way of defining order. And chaos is where you don't know what will happen when you act. And there are two different perceptual mechanisms for those. And so the second one, the danger one, the unexplained one, the foreign territory one, is there's less filtering and there's less specification of center, because you don't know what's important, right? You're walking through that dangerous neighborhood. It's like you're on alert and you don't know what's insignificant. That's part of being on alert. So there's no identifiable center, and that's a high stress situation. Okay.
Now, where I think it immediately gets more complicated, and you psychologists know more about this than I do, is even if we stay with those examples, the question about what happens automatically and what is under our volitional control is another dimension that has to cut across. Even if we grant that in both cases, whether I'm focused or whether I'm diffused attention, I'm aware of reality in some direct sense. It is true that if in either of those cases, if I'm the artist focusing on the particular dot and my child suddenly screams, right, then I will involuntarily or automatically lose that focus and go to attend to attend.
Yeah, that's been quite mapped out neurophysiologically,
that's right.
The Russians did a very good job of that starting in about 1960. Sokolov was one of them, and a woman named Vinogradova, and they were students of a neuropsychologist named Luria. They mapped out what they described as the orienting reflex. And that's exactly what that is. It's like you're focused on a task and something of pragmatic
import.
Yeah. Of implicit significance distracts you from your goal. Yeah. And so there's a hierarchy of gradated responses that are part of that orienting reflex.
But then even, I think another interesting case would be you're the artist, and you know that sometimes your kid cries out and screams, but you've given yourself a signal. You know, I'm angry at my kid right now. He's been a brat. Yeah. I'm going to ignore him when he screams. So I'm focusing, exact same scenario, kid screams. Yeah. I register it. Well, my reaction is quite different. I stay focused. Well,
that shows you how malleable even those relatively low-level instinctual responses are.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's going to be a backfeed loop.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's part of the consequence of the higher order brain centers feeding. Like, there isn't a primary level of perception that has no top-down modification. It's even the primary visual cortex, say where your fovea meets the visual cortex for the first time, is tremendously innervated by multiple. Well, so here's an example. So when you look at an object, when you look at a pen, for example, let's say that constitutes a visual pattern. It's represented on the retina as a pattern. It's propagated along the nerves, and then it branches out. One of the places that information ends up quite quickly is the motor cortex. So when you see almost all the objects that you see in the world, you see because they're definable in terms of the action you take in their presence. So like when you see this pen, the grip motion that you would use to use it is directly disinhibited by the sight of the pen. And that's part of the perception. It's not like you see the pen and think about its use. That isn't how it works at all. You see its use directly. And so that's another thing that's very strange about object perception. It's like you don't actually see objects in the world. What you see are tools and obstacles. And, well, then there's all the things you don't see. And the tools and obstacles are defined in relationship to your goal. So, you know, your goal, for example, the example you used is you're not happy with your child. So the goal there has shifted from respond to distress cries. It's shifted from that, which might be the default, right, to certain probability that distress cry is false, right, or manipulative, therefore ignore. Very different interpretive framework, very different social landscape, and capable of modifying even almost the base level perception. You'll still hear the cry. I mean, I guess that would be even curious. It's like if your child is, it's highly probable, if your child is likely to emit distress calls that are false, my suspicions are you'd be less likely to hear that, to actually hear it, not only not to respond to it, right? Because you'd have built an inhibitory structure that says, well, despite the instinctual significance of that, it's irrelevant. Right. Highly likely.
Yeah. But to come back to like your pen example and the issue of as sophisticated cognizers, when we are perceiving the world, that we have their use function kind of built into the
perception.
Yeah. I'm going to put that in quotation marks right now.
Yeah.
Right. And then the action that's going to be embodied in that use, it also in many cases seems to be built into the perception. I think if we unpack that more, there's still going to be a very sophisticated set of learning we have to do about what is built into the physiological system and the psychological system right at birth, and how much of it is learned. Because I don't think because I don't think we want to say that, you know, even in the 21st century where we come into the world born with a kind of a pre-cognized understanding of pens. Right. And how to use pens.
We probably have a pre-cognized understanding of tool.
I don't even know if we have that. Instead, I think we have a certain physiological structure that, right, and a certain conceptual structure that's built on that, such that, and it's going to be very flexible and amenable to different environmental circumstances to adapt to and conceive of things whatever their intrinsic properties as potential tools.
Yeah, well, a lot of that.
So let me just to try another example to get to because I like the earlier movie example and the male-female difference. One thing that comes up in couples is how they learn to be tuned to each other's voices and the sound of their own voice. So couples who before they met each other would go to a loud party and they would be talking to each other.
Yeah, that's a really good example.
Yeah, that's right. And there's just noise, and it's a big decibel level, right? But then once they become couples and they have heard each other say their name, I say Jordan, Stephen, right, or whatever, they can be in a relatively loud party, separated across the room, right? And the guy's wife says Stephen, right? And he can pick that out of that incredible maelstrom of sounds.
Yeah. Well, that's what you do if you're in a restaurant that's bustling with conversation. What's so remarkable is if you're sitting with someone and there's conversations everywhere, you can tune yourself so that you hear the person that you're sitting beside, you hear them, but then you can turn your attention to a conversation beside you and it'll prioritize that. Or you can turn your attention to your own thoughts, right? And it is this, and I would say that's something like the imposition of that tabernacle-like structure on that plethora of potential interpretations. That's what the postmodernists would point out. There's an infinite number of potential interpretations in a restaurant that's bustling with conversation. It's like, fair enough, but you prioritize one. That's what it means to pay attention to it, right? Is that you prioritize it. You make something a center. You make everything else a periphery. And then you learn to do that automatically, right? With practice. I think maybe the best example of that for literate people is the fact that you can't see a word without reading it, right?
Yeah, because you've automated certain behaviors.
That's right. You've automated it.
That's right.
Exactly. So that centers now
what
built into the perception.
what the postmoderns do, right, is that they take what I think is a virtue, right, that we can automate all of these things and we can learn to detect various things and focus on this, that, and the other thing, all of which are great strengths of the human consciousness, and they turn them into negatives. They turn them into vices. So what they say is, right, an interpretation then becomes in their language, because they've already got an epistemological theory, a negative epistemological theory, as something that is necessarily subjective.